The evidence is that this sort of corporate-serving bias could continue to distort humanity's response to a predicament that was caused by that bias. It's why so many people are now rejecting the idea, or very skeptical of the idea, that societies are going to be protected by more executives and bureaucrats getting together at events like this. Instead, they're anticipating disruption in their own communities, worse than they're already seeing, and around the world, they're beginning to change their lives and work as a result. And I think it's that which we need to act in solidarity with.
Welcome to Facing Future TV, live from COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. The title of this session is Beyond Maladaptation. Around the world, many projects are being promoted, funded, or licensed with claims they can help adaptation or adjusting to the impacts of the climate crisis. The proposals come from every corner of society and every industry, from energy, transportation, to water and healthcare. Many are in reality not adaptation motivated and raise concerns over equality and human rights. Many fail on their own promises. The climate justice movement and advocates worldwide have proposed alternatives to these solutions, ways to create wholesale change away from extraction, away from consumptive growth models. But these models are often not taken seriously. To discuss this subject further, I'm joined by Dr. Jem Ben-Bell, my co-host, and I am Raya Salter, and we're also joined by Dr. Bao. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Raya. Yeah, maladaptation is a term which Dr. Lisa Schipper, who hopefully will be joining us soon, has used in her work. And it really is to point out that nearly all projects under the banner of adaptation have significant ecological and carbon footprints. And many of these initiatives are actually just rebranded old school development activities rather than actually being driven by a prime focus on the need for adaptation. The reason could be influence by commercial interests over policy making. Because we've absolutely seen the influence of corporate interests over the mitigation agenda over the last 30 years. And it could be because governments, east, west, north, south, are not sufficiently accountable to the communities that are being affected by the current disturbances. The adaptation agenda really does reflect a lot of the issues that are already well established around the lack of accountability in development generally. Now, this may therefore not be news to those of us who've worked in international cooperation for some time, but the scale of the failures under the banner of adaptation was quite new to me before I started looking at this and the research that's emerging on it. Today, I'm really pleased we're going to hear from Dr. Stella Nyambura from Kenya, who both critiques the mainstream international and national-led adaptation agenda, but also works on different ways of responding at the local level. So we're going to hear from Stella first. Before then, Lisa will also offer her views as an academic and an analyst and an IPCC author. So first, Stella, over to you.
Thank you, Jem. Hi, everyone. So I'm going to start by looking at maladaptation in farmer livelihoods. So studies on maladaptation in Africa are quite few, but I'll give some examples from climate smart agriculture. Farmers who face harsh conditions like sporadic rain, temperature stress, pests, and therefore low food production are presented this as an opportunity to sustain themselves. But what happens, what presents maladaptation, is, for example, in migration, or where farmers find other activities that are more stable. They're likely to move away from food production, which is their main livelihood and important to global South economies. Regenerative agroforestry has great promise for these people. I work in regenerative agroforestry with the Abundant Earth Foundation and ARC, Agroforestry Regeneration Communities. We support projects that apply regenerative practices. So that is agroecology, permaculture, and syntropic agroforestry. Currently, our projects are in East Africa and with a focus on Malawi and Guatemala. We've established 5,000 food forests, planted 2 million trees in the past year, trained about 6,000 community members. I'll speak more on syntropic farming because in it I've seen a solution that's scalable, mimics most the growth of forests, and is an old age practice of the world's indigenous communities. Also, mostly importantly, in our projects, we've seen results as soon as 3 months in, by which I mean healthy produce, in variety, regenerated soils, and so on. Some of the principles it's a bit technical at first. The succession, which refers to the order of plant growth in forests. So we begin with the lichens, and then grass, and then shrubs to trees. So not separately, but as the forest advances, it supports more complex plants. Trees that grow first start to create root systems that other successive plants will thrive on. Think of it as the foundation of the forest. And the more the root systems, the more the forest can support life. The stratification means vertical layering. This is to ensure that plants that do well when, need, 10% sunlight can be placed close to plants that need, 80% sunlight, one shading the other. But also fully grown, they're likely to be at different heights. So this is information that needs to be worked in from the beginning. It means you can do vegetables, fruit trees, herbs in the same space. And we're talking adjacent to each other, not trees in one place and bananas in the other, and herbs separately, because that's not how forests work. They're organic, random, but intentional. The other thing is keeping soil covered for moisture retention and soil organic matter, but also pruning for more soil cover. Pruning also improves activity, which means fast growth of plants. So from these regenerative systems, we get co-benefits for both people and plants. For people, we're talking nutrition, we're talking lower temperatures, we're talking carbon sequestration. For the planet, regeneration, biodiversity, and abundance. Such a transformation of degraded landscapes would play an important role in reducing risks that climate change presents these communities, especially in the global south. Thank you.
Thank you, Stella. For me, I'm learning a lot from Dr. Stella Nyumbao. I had not understood a critique of so-called smart, climate-smart agriculture before. And it's really interesting then when you have a different paradigm, you have a different understanding of what the future possibilities will be. And so, yeah, it's very eye-opening to me. What I've also learned from the work of our next speaker is how the kind of problems that Stella has identified are not uncommon at all. So Dr. Lisa Schipper analyzes this global arena of climate adaptation. And she works in development geography at the University of Bonn and formerly as a fellow with Oxford University. Dr. Schipper was coordinating lead author of Working Group 2's contribution to the 6th assessment report in a chapter that was entitled Climate Resilient Development Pathways. And she's also a leading academic in this field, editing a related journal. So Lisa, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me here and the chance to talk about maladaptation, which I think is something that I've been particularly obsessed with for probably since I started looking at adaptation, which is about 2 decades ago. And I think that at that time we didn't really understand what adaptation was, and therefore we were also concerned with when would adaptation strategies actually backfire and when could they turn into something that would be bad, which is maladaptation, mal being bad. But over the years, funding for adaptation projects has increased, and adaptation projects have become, we have now thousands of adaptation projects around the world. And so in the latest IPCC AR6 report, in Working Group 2, what we were able to do is to see how, in fact, this evidence of what's happening with adaptation strategies is showing us that we're not succeeding very often, and that a lot of adaptation projects are making people worse off. But this is concerning because funding for adaptation, even though there is, in some people's views, a huge gap in the amount of funding that's needed for adaptation, I would also argue we don't quite know exactly how much money we need for adaptation. But if we were to say, hypothetically, there's a lot of money we need, I think we can agree on that, but how much, I think, is the big question. But clearly that funding is increasing and more projects are kind of growing up. And so we do need to think about how is this money being used. So it's a real thing. And from the outset, for the last 2 decades, we've talked a lot about whether adaptation to climate change is about addressing just the impacts of climate change, or whether it's actually supposed to be about addressing the underlying drivers of vulnerability. Why are people even vulnerable to climate change? Why do they worry about climate change? And most projects still address mainly these impacts and stay on the surface, and so they don't really get at the root causes of the problem. And this is essentially why we then end up with maladaptation, because we have projects that don't consider what the context is, and they therefore don't address these issues, and so continue to have vulnerability to climate change. But I guess just to be more concrete about it, I think the way we define maladaptation is essentially adaptation that ends up making a specific group more vulnerable to climate change or undermines opportunities for future adaptation. And it isn't a term that has been invented by climate change researchers. It's a term that comes from evolutionary biology, and it's something that exists. And it's something that even disaster risk researchers have used. But what we're seeing especially now is that particularly the best examples are infrastructure, and infrastructure projects to prevent coastal erosion, to prevent storm surge and other kinds of flooding, and especially in coastal areas. That is kind of the ultimate example of when adaptation or efforts to adapt go wrong and make people worse off. And I don't have any photos to show, but there are examples where sea level rise walls have actually end up making people on the inside worse off, because, for instance, in Fiji, when there's a huge rainstorm, there was a project that didn't take into account the fact that they also, when they build the wall to protect from the storm, from the sea, they didn't take into account the fact that it also rains heavily and that they need to make sure that the rainwater is also released somewhere. So you ended up with huge flooding on the inside after the infrastructure was created. Other types of examples are where an infrastructure is built to protect one area, but what happens in the end is it actually just shifts the problem further down the coastline. And there's an example from a project in Kiribati where people were the people who were part of the project were protected, but further down the coastline, the coastal erosion just picked up even worse and created new problems. And additionally, you could say that there is quite a big kind of range in how maladaptation is interpreted, and there are some definitions where projects that increase greenhouse gas emissions are considered to be maladaptation as well, and I would argue that that's a little bit of a misleading way of understanding maladaptation, because I think that would be malmitigation. But we've got, So I guess ultimately we see too many examples of projects that haven't taken into account the context, haven't taken into account, spoken to local people, integrated them in the project planning, and essentially then result in increased vulnerability.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Really speaking to unintended consequences, opportunities lost, and so often the bad impacts happen to those who are already the most marginalized. Thank you so much for sharing those perspectives. And now we're here again from Dr. Bendel.
Yeah, thank you, Raya, and thank you, Lisa. That's why I think the principles around locally led climate adaptation are really important. It's, as I was saying at the start, it's an age-old issue, the lack of downwards accountability of all kinds of development interventions, and that's the same, it seems, with adaptation projects. So the research that you're doing, and also the local experiences that we've heard about from Stella, I think demonstrate that a major change in approach is needed for more relevant adaptation to global heating. I think that makes sense, because why would we think that ideas and initiatives arising from the same ideology, systems and institutions that allowed global heating to reach a crisis in the first place are now going to help us to respond well to that crisis, especially as it worsens over time? Sadly, these COP events seem to have gone in the opposite direction, becoming more of a venue for people to make money out of this greatest crisis humanity's ever faced. The evidence is that this sort of corporate serving bias could continue to distort humanity's response to a predicament that was caused by that bias. It's why so many people are now rejecting the idea, or very skeptical of the idea, that societies are going to be protected by more executives and bureaucrats getting together at events like this. Instead, they're anticipating disruption in their own communities, worse than they're already seeing, and around the world, they're beginning to change their lives and work as a result, and I think it's that which we need to act in solidarity with. So for some people, and we heard that with Stella, with the agroforestry work, it's involving a kind of self-authored humanitarian ecological activity. People working on local resilience through creating agricultural systems that require fewer industrial inputs, rebooting local trading systems, even launching local currencies that help insulate communities from the fluctuating winds of global finance. And that's even before we've entered this new era where things are incredibly unstable and could break at any time. One example that I've been involved with a bit for some years now comes from the informal settlements in Kenya and now South Africa and Cameroon. It's the Sarafu network, where local communities are issuing physical and digital vouchers redeemable as payment for local goods and services. It's operating in over 50 areas now, and they call them community inclusion currencies, and they're backed by credible promises of local goods and services. So this is in the power of the local communities themselves, rather than waiting for someone else to come to their aid. This success is what I call a practical deep adaptation. It's deep because, unlike most adaptation, it doesn't rely on the industrial consumer systems that are becoming increasingly disrupted by the direct and indirect impacts of environmental change. Of course, another aspect of this new climate adaptation agenda that has been widely ignored until now is psychological. Many of us in these conference halls are deeply troubled by the knowledge we have of both current disruption and what we know is to come. So understandably, we can push it all away, distract ourselves by being busy, expert, moral, and important sometimes. But the deeper adaptation to climate change that we need more of must involve helping everyone, including all of us here, to better live with the dark knowledge we have and with the difficult emotions that we have about it. And that means not going back into denial or becoming bitter or possibly desperately authoritarian. Unfortunately, people who talk openly about a more hostile future are often vilified by others who seem to be a bit more attached to a belief in human progress and safety. So I think it's why networks like the Deep Adaptation Forum are important. It's also important to have processes like the IASS Pavilion here. Their next event is on deep adaptation, starts at 2 p.m. And And I think, yeah, what we need to do is help each of us stay with the dread and the sadness, allow that to be part of our reality, to inform our decisions without that becoming disabling. And I think this emotional, psychological aspect of climate adaptation has to be a big part going forward for us to keep making the right decisions, wise decisions, in ever more stressful circumstances. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bendel. And thank you again for joining us live from COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, from Facing Future TV. Thank you.